Imagine standing in the middle of a ruined German street, the dust of a defeated empire still hanging in the air. The war has just ended, but for more than half of the country's people, the struggle is far from over. What happens when a nation wakes up to find millions of its citizens torn away from their homes, scattered across foreign lands, or drifting through their own country like shadows? Picture it. Nearly 9 million bombed-out evacuees, 14 million refugees and expellees, 10 million liberated forced laborers and prisoners, and an immeasurable stream of returning POWs slowly making their way back. How, you might wonder, was this wandering mass of exhausted, disoriented, impoverished souls absorbed back into everyday life? And how did the so-called Volksgenossen, the national comrades of Nazi terminology, transform once more into ordinary German civilians? These questions, so essential and human, often fade in the blinding glare of grand historical events. Yet it was in the mundane rhythm of daily existence that the most dramatic transformations unfolded. Food distribution, looting, currency exchanges, the search for something, anything to buy. All these defined the new reality, and intertwined with survival came the complicated realm of human affection. Wartime destruction had been followed by a surge of fleeting relationships, a brief storm of physical closeness born from despair and uncertainty. Then came the heartbreak, the long-awaited husbands who never returned. And amidst that sorrow, another impulse grew, an urge to break away, to start fresh. Divorce rates surged as many Germans reached for a new beginning, longing for a life untouched by the nightmares they had endured. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. Today, let us immerse ourselves in the Germany that existed a decade after World War II, and explore how its people navigated the wreckage of their past. And if this journey through memory speaks to you, don't forget to leave a like it. Helps keep history alive. The collective remembrance of post-war Germany is stamped with images so vivid they seem carved into the nation's subconscious. Can you see them? A Russian soldier wrenching a bicycle from a woman's grasp, mysterious black market figures huddling around a mere handful of eggs, rows of temporary barracks crammed with refugees, and families whose homes had been obliterated, women clutching photographs of missing husbands, stopping returning POWs with trembling hope. These stark scenes turned into a kind of silent film, unchangeable, indelible, in the public memory of those first post-war years. But remember, half the story is always left on the editing room floor. Time usually softens recollections, bathing them in a warm, nostalgic glow. Yet for post-war Germany, the opposite occurred. With each passing year, the remembered past grew darker. Why? Because so many Germans who had not been persecuted by the Nazi regime still wished to view themselves as victims. And the more terrifying the accounts of the famine winters of 1946 and 1947, the lighter their personal guilt seemed to become. But if we listen closely, we can also catch fragments of laughter. In 1946, a spontaneous Rosenmontag carnival procession wound its way through a Cologne still eerily empty, its spirit insisting on survival. Journalist Margaret Bovary later confessed that life had felt strangely heightened beneath the constant shadow of death. During those years, when there was literally nothing to buy, she felt so unexpectedly content that even when things improved, she no longer wished for major purchases. Misery cannot be understood without acknowledging the peculiar joy it sometimes births. Escaping death drove some into numbness and others into an intense, almost reckless passion for life. Families had been splintered, social structures dismantled, bonds severed. Yet slowly, tentatively, people reached toward one another again, especially the young and spirited, who treated the surrounding chaos as if it were a vast playground where they sought to craft a new everyday life. Strangely, the Holocaust lingered only faintly in the thoughts of most Germans in the immediate post-war years. Some admitted the horrors committed on the Eastern Front and accepted a vague, general sense of guilt for having unleashed the war. Yet for many, the systematic murder of millions of German and European Jews simply could not find a place in their emotional world. Only a handful, among them philosopher Karl Jaspers, dared to speak publicly about it. Even the major Protestant and Catholic declarations of guilt issued in August 1945 did not explicitly mention the Jews. Insidiously, the sheer impossibility of grasping the Holocaust seeped into the consciousness of the very nation that had carried it out. The crimes were so vast, so monstrous, that they were pushed aside even as they were still happening, and the refusal of many well-intentioned people to reflect on what had happened to their deported neighbors remains a wound that still undermines humanity's trust in itself. Most Germans of the time bore the guilt of this silence. The concealment surrounding the extermination camps persisted long after the war had ended. Despite Allied attempts to force the defeated Germans to confront the evidence, post-war Chancellor Helmut Kohl later coined the bitterly ironic phrase, "the blessing of late birth," suggesting that younger generations had no right to moral superiority. Yet there was also, in a grim sense, a blessing in having experienced terror firsthand. The nights filled with air raids, the famine winters of the early post-war years, the exhausting, daily fight for survival. These burdens left many Germans with little space to contemplate their own responsibility. Seeing themselves as victims allowed them to avoid looking directly at the truth. After all, if they had faced the reality of the mass murder carried out in their name, enabled by their silence and their willingness to avert their eyes, how would they have found the strength to endure the post-war years at all? Instinct for survival softened guilt, a collective psychological phenomenon studied extensively after 1945, and one that should unsettle anyone who still believes in human moral clarity. Though works like Anne Frank's diary or Eugen Kogon's The SS State broke through this repression, it was not until the beginning of the Auschwitz trials in 1963 that many Germans finally began confronting the crimes committed in their name. To the younger generation, the delay was unforgivable. In their eyes, their parents had burdened themselves with deep dishonor, even as their children materially benefited from the older generation's ability to suppress the past. Rarely in history has a generational conflict erupted with such intensity. So much anger, so much confidence, as the clash between the youth of 1968 and their parents. Today, the dominant image of the post-war years is shaped by those who were young back then. Their anti-authoritarian outrage, their inability to love the parental generation that had failed them, their fierce eloquence, all helped create the enduring myth of the suffocating, outdated 1950s that had to be swept away, a myth that persists even in the face of more nuanced historical research. The generation born around 1950 took pride in shaping the Federal Republic West Germany into a livable state and in giving democracy a soul, and they continue to promote this self-image. But the reality of the era was more complex. Former Nazi elites still filled many offices in the Federal Republic, to the disgust of many. Amnesty for Nazi criminals was granted with unsettling ease. Yet despite these contradictions, post-war Germany was vibrant, charged with creative energy, full of critical thinkers, bursting with varied opinions, bold art, and messy, contradictory daily life. far more dynamic than the simplified impressions passed down since 1968 would suggest. There is another reason why the first 4 years after the war remain a blind spot in Germany's historical memory. Within the great chapters of national history, this period forms a kind of vacuum, a space to which no one wishes to claim true responsibility. In school textbooks, the narrative of the Nazi era usually ends abruptly with the capitulation of the German Wehrmacht, leaving the aftermath floating in a fog of unresolved questions. Imagine the world in 1949, Germany split down the middle, 2 states rising from the same smoldering wreckage. On one side, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. On the other, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Their birth stories, we often hear, revolve around the currency reform and the Berlin blockade, those dramatic preludes to their founding. But have you ever wondered what truly unfolded in the silent, overlooked years between the end of the war and that monetary turning point? Those fragile, chaotic years that witnessed the Federal Republic's first great economic breakthrough? Strangely enough, historians have long skirted this period, as if lacking a single, tidy institution to anchor the narrative. Even after the fall of the Reich, German history continued to be written like a national biography, with the state cast as the central protagonist. Yet from 1945 onward, who truly held power? Not one government, but 4. Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris each ruled their own occupation zones. How can one weave a seamless national story from such a divided stage? We teach about the horrors inflicted on Jews and forced laborers, and our lessons often conclude with their liberation. Allied soldiers opening camp gates, starving survivors stumbling toward freedom. But what happened after that moment? Picture it. Nearly 10 million emaciated prisoners, torn from their homelands, now left wandering a country ruled by the very people who had tormented and murdered them. How did they respond? How did they survive, physically and morally, in this uncanny limbo? The triangle formed by Allied soldiers, defeated Germans, and freed forced laborers is among the most tragic and compelling dynamics of the post-war world. As events unfolded, attention shifted from the basic struggles of everyday life, scrubbing ruins, clean, stolen goods, forbidden romances, the desperate hunt for food, to the rebirth of cultural life, intellectual exchange, and a startling new visual language. In these expressions, the nation's conscience came under sharper scrutiny. Denazification cases, bearing not only legal, but also aesthetic consequences, were handled with increasing sensitivity. And surprisingly, the enduring artistic legacy of the 1950s, its architecture, its painting, owes much to this transformative moment. As the physical landscape changed, Germans found themselves changed as well. But were Germans truly the only authors of this dramatic reinvention of their world? A fierce debate emerged over art and design, one shaped not merely by domestic thinkers, but by the occupying powers themselves, the United States, Britain, France, and Russia. On this contested cultural battlefield, socialist realism came to define the East, while abstract art became the emblem of the West, each side sculpting its own idea of beauty in the Cold War. Even the CIA played a role in this aesthetic chess match. At that time, Germans cultivated an image of themselves as refined and intellectually saturated, as though resurrecting a polished 19th century gentility, those good old days, or so they wanted them to seem. Today we possess vast knowledge about the Holocaust. But what remains less explored is how life in Germany unfolded beneath its shadow, a shadow stretching over the country's moral future. How does a nation in whose name millions were murdered negotiate culture, ethics, and the very concept of decency? Should one, out of respect, avoid discussing morality altogether and simply let children rediscover right and wrong on their own? In the war's immediate aftermath, media analysts and other institutions threw themselves into rebuilding society. Everyone was searching desperately for meaning. To philosophize among ruins meant to sift through the fragments of existence, just as others sifted for surviving objects in the rubble. Holocaust survivors. When Allied troops stepped into the concentration camps in 1945, they confronted mountains of corpses, haunting evidence of Nazi mass murder. Alongside them were thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish survivors, weak, starving, ravaged by disease. For those who remained alive, the thought of rebuilding a future seemed overwhelming. Many Jewish survivors dreaded returning to their pre-war homes. Anti-Semitism still festered in parts of Europe, and their trauma ran deep. Some who made the journey back feared they might not survive the welcome. Consider post-war Poland, where violent pogroms erupted, the most notorious in Kielce in 1946, when Polish rioters murdered at least 42 Jews and wounded many more. With immigration options scarce, tens of thousands of homeless survivors drifted westward into Allied liberated territories, where they were placed in displaced persons camps and refugee centers, Bergen-Belsen in Germany among them. The UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, along with American, British, and French occupation forces, administered these camps. Numerous Jewish organizations also stepped in. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee offered food and clothing, and the Organization for Rehabilitation through Training provided vocational education. Refugees built their own committees as well, many advocating the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. The largest of these groups, She'eret HaPleta, the surviving remnant, fought for expanded immigration opportunities. Yet U.S. immigration remained tightly bound by quota laws, and Britain continued to restrict Jewish entry into Palestine. Much of Europe's borders stayed closed. In late 1944, the Jewish Brigade Group, a Palestinian Jewish unit of the British Army, formed and later joined with former partisans to create the Briha, Escape, an underground network helping Jewish refugees leave Europe for Palestine. Meanwhile, Jews already living in Palestine organized clandestine immigration by sea, the movement known as Aliyah Bet. But British authorities intercepted most of these ships. In 1947, they forced the famous vessel Exodus 1947, carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors, to turn back to Germany. Often, intercepted refugees were placed in detention camps on Cyprus. All of this changed with the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948. Refugees and displaced Jews immediately began migrating to the new homeland, possibly around 170,000 by 1953. In the United States, President Harry Truman issued a directive in December 1945, easing immigration quotas for those displaced by Nazi persecution. Under this order, more than 41,000 displaced persons eventually entered the country. Of the displaced persons admitted to the United States, approximately 28,000 were Jews. Then came 1948, a pivotal year, when the U.S. Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that opened the door to roughly 400,000 immigration visas for displaced persons between January 1, 1949 and December 31, 1952. And within that vast tide of humanity, about 68,000 were Jewish survivors seeking a place where life could begin again. Others continued their journeys toward new horizons: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Mexico, South America, South Africa. Each destination offering a promise of safety, dignity, and the fragile hope of rebuilding. Now, imagine rotating the historical lens, turning it slowly until it focuses on the uneasy, often volatile relationship between East Germany and West Germany. Under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, West Germany asserted something bold, even audacious: the right to speak for the entire German nation. This exclusive claim shaped the Hallstein Doctrine, West Germany's diplomatic compass, which declared that the Federal Republic would refuse recognition of East Germany and would cut ties with any nation daring to treat the GDR as a sovereign state. But diplomacy was only one battleground. What about the people fleeing constantly, desperately, from east to west? Through the 1950s, a steady stream of East Germans slipped across the internal border, seeking better lives, and this exodus strained relations to the breaking point. In 1952, East Germany sealed its frontier with West Germany, and yet escape routes remained. People still moved from East Berlin to West Berlin, drawn to the freedoms on the other side. Then came the morning that changed everything. August 13th, 1961. Imagine standing in Berlin as barbed wire coils are unrolled, as soldiers take their positions, as concrete blocks rise to divide a city overnight. East Germany began constructing the Berlin Wall, choking off the flow of refugees to a mere trickle. In a matter of hours, West Berlin transformed into a geopolitical island, an enclave of the Western world, marooned in communist territory. The wall quickly became more than just a barrier. It grew into the symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of Europe's division. Soon after, the broader border between the two German states hardened into a militarized fault line. But history rarely stands still. In 1969, Chancellor Willy Brandt stepped onto the stage with a different vision. West Germany, he insisted, would remain firmly anchored within the Atlantic Alliance, yet it must also extend a hand eastward. His goal? To soften tensions, to heal torn families, to nurture dialogue rather than deepen hostility. Under Brandt's Ostpolitik, West Germany sought improved relations with the Eastern Bloc, above all with East Germany, while holding fast to its guiding principle. Two German states, yes, but one German nation. Gradually, almost cautiously, relations thawed. And then a series of agreements began to redraw the diplomatic map: the Moscow Treaty, August 1970, the Warsaw Treaty, December 1970, the Four-Power Agreement on Berlin, September 1971, the Transit Agreement, May 1972, the Basic Treaty, December 1972. Together they paved the way toward normalized relations between East and West Germany, and ultimately, both states stood side by side as they entered the United Nations in September 1973. A remarkable moment in a long and complicated journey. Thank you for watching, for staying with this story, for keeping history alive. God bless you all, and until we meet again, farewell.